Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's daily devotional. I am going to attempt to have a shorter daily devotional today. I try to aim for around 10 or 15 minutes, and lately it's been around 20 or 22 minutes. So I'm going to aim for a little bit of a shorter one today. So our daily devotional today is coming from Exodus chapter 32, starting in, mainly just verse 1. We have the situation back in chapter 31 where the children of Israel, they've come to Mount Sinai. Moses has gone up on the mountain to receive the law from the Lord. And keep in mind that this is the same Mount Sinai that was shaking with thundering and lightning. There was the commandment that the children of Israel were not to set foot on the mount itself. So this is after, obviously, that they have been led out of Egypt. God separated the Red Sea. I mean, there have been many the plagues, obviously. So there have been signs and wonders that God has done up to this point that has shown him to be the God, the one and true God. But in verse 1, it says, "Now when the people saw that Moses delayed coming down from the mountain, the people gathered together to Aaron and said to him, 'Come make us gods that shall go before us.' Excuse me. As for this Moses, the man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him." So there's a couple things I want to point out here. First thing is that obviously Aaron, being the brother of Moses, there was a lot of things that Aaron should have done. He should have stopped the people from talking this way. He should have reminded them about the works of God. Aaron is going to be high priest, whether he knows that or not, but he's going to be high priest, and his son's after him. And so he should have corrected them about make us gods. Why would you want to follow any kind of gods that you had to make yourself? Does that make any sense? It doesn't make a lot of sense to me. If you've got to make your own gods, then obviously you've got more power than your gods do. So that doesn't make a lot of sense. But regardless, Aaron should have defended Moses, and he should have defended and stood up for God's power and God's might. However, the second thing I want to point out is that notice that they say Moses brought us up out of the land of Egypt. Moses, on regular occasions, reminded the people, and not only up to this point, but after this point as well, that it was Jehovah that led them through or out of the land of Egypt. However, they aren't thinking about Jehovah. In fact, at no point here does Jehovah ever come up in this dialogue between the people and Aaron. Not once. Jehovah is not mentioned. False gods are mentioned. Moses, whom we don't know what's happened to him, so who knows if he's dead, who knows what's going on. But, there's no thought whatsoever with regard to Jehovah. And then in obviously verse 2, Aaron says to break off the golden earrings and the jewelry that they have. So they brought it to Aaron, and in verse 4, He received the gold from their hand, and he fashioned it with an engraving tool and made a molded calf. And they said, "This is your God, O Israel, that brought you out of the land of Egypt." The text says they said. Depend whether Aaron was saying this along with the rest of them. Certainly, it would seem to be that he certainly was complicit, obviously. Whether or not he was actually making this statement. It says, then they said. So whether he was a part of this group that was actually presenting this as a god, certainly Aaron is going to build an altar in verse 5 and 6. So when Aaron saw it, he built an altar before it. And Aaron made a proclamation and said, "Tomorrow is a feast to the Lord." Then they rose up early on the next day, offered burnt offerings, and brought peace offerings, and the people sat down to eat and drink, and rose up to play. And so in verse 7, God is angry at Israel. They have turned aside quickly out of the way which I commanded them. They have made themselves a molded calf, and worshipped it, and sacrificed to it, and said, "This is your God, O Israel, that brought you out of the land of Egypt." And obviously Moses has to plead for the people. And there's a couple of different elements that goes into this situation. They're presenting this calf that they have created themselves as being the God that led them out of Egypt, which is, obviously there's a lot more of a psychology there going into it. Obviously that calf didn't exist until they're here. So they're using it as a representative of kind of their own definition of what their God is going to be. Aaron is complicit in building an altar. He's complicit in encouraging sacrifices. But keep in mind that Israel's background, I'm not offering this as an excuse, I'm offering this as kind of a background understanding, that the outside influence of Egypt was at work here. The fact that Israel had been exposed for so long to polytheism in Egypt, they'd been exposed to physical manifestations, idols of the gods of Egypt. This is kind of what they had learned to associate in terms of religious worship, was these false gods. And again, whether you talk about fear, I know there's some thought, well, they're afraid, and so they want some God that they can see, that they can touch, that they can look to and say, "Here's our God." I tend to think they're just impatient. Maybe there is some fear here. I mean, they say we don't know what's happened to Moses, but okay, well, if they were convinced that Moses was dead, then Aaron could step in if that was the case. Instead, it just sounds like they were impatient, and they weren't prepared to follow a God that they couldn't see, that they couldn't define for themselves. And that's the beauty, well, I say the beauty, that's the danger of the beauty, I guess, of false gods, is that ultimately when you create your own God, you can create them in whatever image you want. You can create a calf, a golden calf. You can decide what religion you want to set up or how it needs to be worshipped. And it's a blank check to basically live how you want to and to do what you want to. And Israel at this point, I think they were just impatient. Despite all of the signs and wonders, however long they were sitting there. Of course, I think we understand that Moses was ultimately on the mountain for 40 days. But the ultimate point here is the recognition that Israel just had such a short memory, or at least they chose to have a short memory, that they wanted their own representative for God. That being the case, notice what happens here at the end of chapter 32. After Moses has given this defense or this desire, please don't destroy the people, because God's prepared to destroy the people. The Lord relented from the harm which he said he would do to his people. Verse 15, and Moses turned and went down the mountain, and the 2 tablets of the testimony were in his hand. The tablets were written on both sides. On the one side and on the other they were written. So I guess you could say 4 sides total. There were the 2 tablets written on both sides. So 4 faces, I guess you could say, total, with the testimony. Now, verse 16, the tablets were the work of God, and the writing was the writing of God engraved on the tablets. And when Joshua heard the noise of the people as they shouted, he said to Moses, there is a noise of war in the camp. Keep in mind, Joshua had gone up a certain way. He had stopped. He didn't go all the way up with Moses, but he was up there with Moses up a certain distance. But he said, it is not the noise of the shout of victory, nor the noise of a cry of defeat, but the sound of singing I hear. So it was as soon as he came near the camp that he saw the calf and the dancing, and Moses' anger became hot, and he cast the tablets out of his hand and broke them at the foot of the mountain. And he took the calf which they had made, burned it in the fire, and ground it to powder, and he scattered it on the water, and made the children of Israel drink it. And Moses said to Aaron, what did this people do to you, that you have brought so great a sin upon them? Aaron said, do not let the anger of my Lord become hot. You know the people, that they are set on evil, as if that's an excuse to go along with it. For they said to me, make us gods that shall go before us. As for this Moses, the man who brought us out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him. I said to them, whoever has any gold, let them break it off. So they gave it to me, and I cast it into the fire, and this calf came out. There was no intent there of making a calf. I just threw the gold in the fire, and whoop, there's a calf. Now when Moses saw the people were unrestrained, for Aaron had not restrained them to their shame among their enemies, then Moses stood at the entrance of the camp and said, whoever is on the Lord's side, come to me. And all the sons of Levi gathered themselves together to him. And so ultimately the Moses commands the children of Levi to go about, kill every man his brother, every man his companion and neighbor. So the sons of Levi, they took charge of that. 3,000 people, 3,000 men were killed. And then Moses calls on them to consecrate themselves. And then in verse 30, he says, I'm going to make atonement for you. And so he goes up to the Lord. Oh, these people have committed a great sin. They have made for themselves a god of gold. Yet now, if you will forgive their sin, but if not, I pray, blot me out of your book which you have written. And then in verse 33, the Lord said to Moses, whoever has sinned against me, I will blot him out of my book. Now therefore go, lead the people to the place of which I have spoken to you. Behold, my angel shall go before you. Nevertheless, in the day when I visit for punishment, I will visit punishment upon them for their sin. And so the Lord plagued the people because of what they did with the calf which Aaron made. It's an interesting account of thousands of people who just are so fickle in their thought process and in their willingness to serve God that all of a sudden Moses has been up on the mountain for, presumably about a month, and we don't know what's happened to him, so let's make ourselves a new god. Or even, I don't even think that, I wouldn't even say that they were even making a representative of Jehovah. Jehovah isn't mentioned at all in what the people present. But it is interesting to me that Aaron, he makes this, it's an excuse is what it is. When he says, you know the people, that they are set on evil. And they demanded that I make them gods, so I told them to give me the gold, and I threw it in the fire, and here it is. As if Aaron didn't have a choice. And it's interesting that when Moses comes down from the mountain, obviously Joshua's with him, the people don't stop Moses. They don't rebel in the sense of taking hold of Moses and saying, no, Moses, this is our God now. We're not listening to you anymore. Moses comes down, I guess, presumably everybody's, oh, he's still alive, and so he comes, he takes the calf, he grinds it up, he puts it in the water, makes them drink it. They still, I guess you could say, still respected the leadership or authority of Moses here, but it just goes to show the fickle nature of not just the people of Israel, but man's fickle nature. That when it's kind of a whatever have you done for me lately type of mentality. Israel, for however many days Moses was up there at that point, they got to the point where, well, what has Jehovah done for us lately? Okay, and they hadn't seen Joshua, they hadn't seen Moses, and so let's have a new God pop in here. And it reminds me, and again, regardless of what mindset or mentality was behind it, whatever attitude was behind it, whether you want to say that they were afraid, I'm not going to give them that benefit of the doubt. I think they were just impatient, and they just wanted to do what they wanted to do. And it just goes to show, it goes to remind us that what Paul says in 2 Corinthians chapter 7 and in verse 1. And of course, Paul has been building up from chapter 5 and into chapter 6 about the promises of God. And how that Paul, as an ambassador for Christ, chapter 5, chapter 6, he begs them to be reconciled to God and to turn while it is called today, there at the beginning of chapter 6. Chapter 7, verse 1, therefore, having these promises, beloved, let us cleanse ourselves from all filthiness of the flesh and spirit, perfecting holiness in the fear of God. That was the character or the mindset that did not exist in Israel in that moment. And one could make the argument that they had a continual problem going beyond just there in the wilderness at Mount Sinai. This was a major problem going forward for Israel, that they didn't, their go-to thought process was not about the promises of God. Their go-to thought process was not about how God had shown his power. And they turned to filthiness of the flesh and the spirit. They did not have fear of God. They had only their desires a lot of times, and fear of man a lot of times. Fear of their enemies. When God says, if you'll just serve me, I'll take care of your enemies. And it goes to show, and again, the whole application for us is that sometimes people can have the mindset of, whether this is politics or friendships or whatever, sometimes people have a selfish mindset of, what have you done for me lately? And whether the fickle nature of people's thoughts are based in fear or based in anger, a lot of times they are of a selfish nature. They focus only on, what have I gained lately? What have you done for me lately? And our first thought process, no matter what's going on in the world, no matter what's going on in politics, no matter what's happening, even if it's things that we don't like or things that we wish were different, our first thought process doesn't need to be, God, where are you? Or, God, why'd you let this happen? We don't have the right to ask God, why did you let this happen? That's one of the very lessons that Job learned, is that I don't have a right to ask you, why did you let this happen? It happened, it was your will, and I can speculate over the reasons, but I have no right to demand an answer. And it reminds us that our first thought process needs to be the fear of God, that God is in control, that his promises are eternal, and that those promises, no matter what's happening in our world, no matter what's happening in our lives, we have to focus on being clean and pure of the filthiness of the flesh and spirit, and making sure we focus on holiness or purity in the fear of God. This stands in stark contrast to Israel in its history, and it stands in contrast to the types of mentalities and the types of character of people we see today. And this is what God calls on us to be today. All right, so that's the lesson for you today. I hope that that's something beneficial and uplifting for us to consider, looking at the example of Israel at Mount Sinai and comparing it here to 2 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 1. I guess I could have moved my face down here so that you could have actually read it if I had noticed it at the time. But regardless, that's the daily devotional for you today. So keep in mind, tomorrow we will have our next daily devotional at 6:30. So Lord willing, I will see you all then. Until then, y'all take care and be safe. Thanks, everybody.